And so this is a project led by my colleague at Central State, Dr. Brandy Phipps. We have partners with a tribal college in Wisconsin, the College of Menominee Nation. We're also working with Kentucky State University, which is another HBCU, University of Kentucky, and University of Arkansas and Mississippi State University. So we have a number of partners on the project. It's a large project.
Hey guys, it's Mandy with Global Hemp Association. I wanted to say thank you so much for joining. I'm excited about the opportunity to build a relationship and connect this supply chain. I mean, after all, that's why we started the association. Our association was built on the foundation of connecting supply chain, building relationships, and helping you grow your business. Anyone from farmers, manufacturers, and distributors, people that are passionate about the supply chain, and those creating products selling into biofuels, plastics, textiles, construction, and building materials.
And we're live. Hi, Craig. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Mandy.
Are you good? We were playing with sound earlier this morning. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for chiming in and joining today. If you have any questions about today's topic, we'd love to hear them. Thank you very much, Jay. It's great to see you. Thanks for always saying hello. I hope things are good for you. But I just want to real quick, I want to dive into this topic and into hemp as animal feed or fish feed in particular, and what Dr. Craig's been working on. But before we do start, Craig, give us a little background about who you are, what you do, and how you got into this industry.
Yeah, so I've been in the industry since I started in Kentucky in 2014. So I've been doing this for a bit. But before that, my background's really in a lot of things plants. I did my undergrad and master's degrees at Purdue University, in horticulture science, plant genetics, and breeding for my undergrad. And then I did a master's in plant pathology because I was really having an interest in plant-made products. And then I went to the University of Kentucky to do my PhD, where I was working with a medicinal plant called Madagascar periwinkle, which produces some anti-cancer drugs. And so when I was there, it was in the middle of my PhD program, and the 2014 Farm Bill happened. And, you know, there was a huge interest in hemp in Kentucky at the point in time. And so I kind of I got involved right at the start because our lab worked with plant-made compounds, so the cannabinoids were particularly interesting at that time. There's still some pathway steps and stuff that weren't known for the synthesis of like CBD or the cannabidiol and THC.
Yeah.
But I was particularly fascinated with all the grain and fiber applications, and so it was just a multi-use plant. And there was just so many things I could see being done with it. And that really was interesting to me, where I've worked with many different plants over the course of my life. And so I like all aspects of plants, from, you know, field agronomy to horticulture side, to production and processing, and all those components of agriculture. So this was really an opportunity, an interest to me, because there were so many things that could be done with it. And there's so many, and more importantly, I've always been interested in research. And so there's so many things we didn't know and still don't know, which makes it a lot of fun for research, because we get to ask a lot of these questions and try to find answers to some of these really important problems that the industry faces.
Yeah. Okay. So you're currently working on a pretty good sized grant and research around hemp as fish food, right? Can you talk a little bit about what the grant is for, and what are some of the key things you guys are studying and looking at?
Yeah. So I'm currently a research assistant professor of natural products at Central State University, which is a historically Black college located in Southwest Ohio. And so, for those of you that are not aware, we're about halfway between Columbus, Ohio, and Cincinnati, Ohio, in that general vicinity. And so I have a number of projects going on, and this is a project looking at fish feed or hemp grain as a potential ingredient for fish feed. And so this is a project led by my colleague at Central State, Dr. Brandy Phipps. We have partners with a tribal college in Wisconsin, the College of Menominee Nation. We're also working with Kentucky State University, which is another HBCU, University of Kentucky, and University of Arkansas and Mississippi State University. So we have a number of partners on the project. It's a large project. It's a $10 million grant that we've received to look at this, and this was through competitive funding provided by the USDA. And it's really, I think their interest in it was that this is something that could help multiple avenues, not just within the hemp space, but also within the aquaculture space. And so there's a number of people working on hemp as a feed ingredient for different animals. Multiple people have been involved with the Hemp Feed Coalition and their work for the chicken application that's went in for chickens. There's people working in Kansas State, working on cattle, Oregon's working on some work as well as others. But we took the approach to look at fish, and we see that as being, we took that approach because one of the challenges with fish production, aquaculture production, particularly of carnivorous fish like trout, which is a fish we're working with, the diet requires fish meal and fish oil. And those are very unsustainable products that are being used in feed, because basically all of that is coming from wild caught fish species that their stocks are massively being depleted at a global or an international level all across the globe. Yeah. And if we run out of them, that's gonna not only be bad for the aquaculture industry, it's going to be devastating on our ocean ecosystems. And so we really, as an aquaculture industry, we really have to find alternative sources for that protein. And so one of the approaches people have looked at has been and has considered is to address this issue is really looking at what we call vegetable oils, vegetable proteins, which are basically plant derived. You could get, there's other work being done looking at insects in feeds for protein and, other animal byproducts and stuff. But at this, really there's a keen interest on trying to find a plant source that we could feed these animals for production, and so we could shift them off of this really unsustainable source. And so, we always hear hemp as being a sustainable crop. And this is just one other way that this could be, increased sustainability. And it's not directly by the hemp itself and its production. It's the removing another unsustainable product out of the system. And so that's, the overarching goal of what we're trying to do is basically doing studies that will evaluate whether this ingredient can work as a fish feed. And again, we're specifically looking at rainbow trout to start with. But once that door opens, we'll be able to expand to other fish species as well. But what we want to do is do all the studies that would be required for AAFCO and FDA CVM approval, which is what's required to get a feed ingredient to for commercial production processes.
Okay, what are some of the things that you've found that have really been there's a lot of research I think that can be done, right, where we want to meet AAFCO and meet some of these regulators, with the information they need so that they can approve it. What's some of the information that you guys have found or are really looking at that would help to potentially move this process along?
Yeah, so I'll start with, this is a 5-year project. We're a year into the project. We At this point in time, we were hoping to have, what the plan was to have some digestibility studies started, and so be able to start getting some of that information. But what we found was, to get some of the um, we need to process the hemp in ways that are a little different than other more conventional approaches, and so we want to, and by that, also fish, particularly trout, they like a low fiber diet because they're meant for eating bugs,
Yeah.
other fish, and things like that. Plants aren't part of their normal diet, so fiber is not usually in there. And so we're going to be looking at the hemp seed oil, but really, the protein product that we want to look at is dehulled hearts, and doing that with the fat still in them, and doing that with the fat removed from those. And we've been working on. It took a while to get a dehuller here, because we're not a commercial operation, so to buy a commercial outfit, that's there's places in the U.S. that sell those things, but then there's also, we need more than a bench work lab experiment, so we had to find a kind of a middle ground. And the only place we could find a dehuller of that capacity was from China, and so we had to ship that here. We've been trying to get, so then the next problem we run into was, we're hoping and that we could,
will you feed them
like press to get to defat the hearts. But as many people have told us, and we also realized that just doesn't work. So we moved to a hydraulic pressing mechanism, and we spent 6 months trying to get a hydraulic press of a substantial size in that same category from China as well, because there wasn't anything in that range, only for it to have apparently never arrived here. And so now we're actually designing something, and building. We're modifying working a shop press to develop something that will make we'll test, but we'll publish blueprints on how that can be made. So anybody in the U.S. that wants to do this type of work could do it. And so these pieces of equipment could be more accessible stateside. So we haven't got into any of the actual studies yet, because we're still working on the technologies to make the processing feasible to get the product that we know the fish are going to need, because there's a lot of work being done on other animals with the seed cake, or the residual after it's been extruded out of the oil presses. But that contains it contains the protein, but also contains all the hulls, which is where all that fiber is located. And so that's just not we're not even bothering to test that product, because we just know it's not going to work. It's way too much fiber for what these animals can tolerate.
What about the economics of it, right? I mean, a dehulled hemp heart is probably more spendy than the hulls with fiber. So talk to me about like the economics of this as a viable, more sustainable.
Yeah, so that's part of what this whole proposal entails. Aside from just doing the research studies, it's the research to understand the economics of it. And so we're working with actually 3 different economists as part of the project, and that's really some of our partners outside of Central States. So we're working with Tyler Mark at the University of Kentucky. He's well known for his hemp economics, and he's working with the production side of it and how that could potentially impact things. We're working with Dr. Brandon McFadden he's now at the University of Arkansas, was at University of Delaware, and working with him on the consumer side of, okay, if these fish would cost a little more, are people willing to pay for them? If so, what would be the scenarios related with that? And then we're working with Dr. Sung Yoon at the University of Mississippi State University,
I don't know how you keep them straight.
Yeah, that's why. Yeah, it's Mississippi State, and he is. Um, it's his area of expertise is technically ecosystem valuation. We like to say he does the ecosystem economics. So what we do in the process, how that impact the dollar values associated with the impacts on water quality, land use, all those kinds of things that play into the sustainable aspect of it. And so we're going to be looking at all of that to really understand it. But currently, the system we're designing, the de-huller we got, it's going to have we're trying to make this so if somebody wants to be a small scale processor for fish feed, that this is a feasible option for them. And so right now, we've got, including getting the de-huller shipped from China, that's got a capacity. We haven't run the max capacity on, but supposedly multiple, several hundred kilos an hour of processing capacity, of which and it was like it was about $4,000 to get it, including the basically $2,000 to get it shipped here.
Right.
It's about as much in shipping as it was the actual machine.
Right.
And then the press that we're designing, while it'd be more expensive than the Chinese version, you're working to keep that under 10,000 to do that and have the processing capacity of, again, do about six lots every hour, and that would be so about every 10-minute cycle, and do a batch of about 10 kilograms at a time to defat. If we could do the defat, and we're interested in that because that allows us to get just that protein without the fiber, but then also do it with so we can incorporate more into the diet instead of if we max out the capacity with the full fat.
Fat first, sure.
So we're looking at those three products: the oil by itself, just to see how that impacts, but also then the hearts with the fat still in them and the defatted hearts. So it's really going to be interesting to see how much we can put in there. And then we're going to do these. We're going to start with digestibility trials, working with Kentucky State really in their expertise in aquaculture to do that. And then we're going to do some growth studies looking at how it impacts a number of growth parameters throughout a feeding cycle with different varied diets, and seeing, and then we'll look at, things that the FDA, CVM and stuff in AAFCO are interested in, is, the chemical analysis of all the parts, both of the raw ingredients, the processed feed that we're going to be making, and then the extruder will be extruding that feed at Kentucky State, and then we'll have evaluations of all the fish tissue, and so doing a number of metrics there, and the goal is
like how long, say, cannabinoids, if they are in the system, how long they're in the meat, how long they're in the tissue.
Yeah, that's one thing that's we're keenly interested on, that we'll be doing as part of the project. So the dietary, the growth cycle, those are pretty much general things associated with any feed that's going to need to be known for approval. But you hit on exactly the concern that we see, that's what the FDA and AAFCO, well, really the FDA wants to know. I don't think AAFCO has some interest in it, but it's really FDA that's interested in if there's any residual in the animals eating these ingredients. So,
if we're consuming them unknowingly.
Yeah, because if we're consuming them, if they're there, a consumer that doesn't know how they were fed doesn't necessarily get a say in what's there. They would be getting them. Now, we've done some preliminary calculations based on diets and what we know to be on these products. So this is hemp seed and oil unto itself. The cannabinoids are produced on that bract that surrounds the seed. The seed was not, it does not itself have cannabinoids on it, but it can get that transfer from that bract as a contaminant. And so part of that's a handling issue, and a seed cleaning issue. But if it gets on there, we've done calculations based on what it's allowed in food and based on the feeding rates for trout. And it's possible that could accumulate, but we really don't think that's going to be the case, which is why we're really interested. But so Kentucky State's really doing a lot of the traditional digestibility grow trials for us. We're working with Dr. Valdemar Rossi down there. We're focusing a lot more on the profiling of all the raw ingredients, the processed feeds, stability of those of the feed in different scenarios, and then looking at these cannabinoid transference. And so there we've got to develop a number of protocols for testing for those things, because when we evaluate compounds, you can't just say, well, we have testing protocols for cannabis flower and use that for fish tissue, because you got to make sure and do confirmation studies to make sure that you could extract those compounds out of the matrix that it's in, because matrix often interact with compounds in a funky way, and you may use the same extraction process, but it may not pull everything out. And so we want to make sure we get a realistic view of what's there, and FDA is always very concerned about that. We work with the FDA on another project we have related to smoked and vaped hemp products, which is a completely different area. And so we engage with them on a regular basis as part of that contract. And so we kind of understand, the questions we expect them to ask as part of the feed application. And they're very technical, because it's an organization of scientists, and the USDA has a lot of people from different areas, growers, processors, you name it. It's like the hemp industry, very, very broad. Mm-hmm. But the people in FDA, even though they have different backgrounds, they're all scientists and all understand chemistry. And
right.
And so it's when we work with them, we get a sense of those questions. And so we knew going in, cannabinoids were going to be a concern for them. A lot of times we get a lot of people in industry and it's like, well, they're not there, or seeds don't have them. Yeah, it depends on how you detect them, though. You could say it's not there, but if you have a sensitive enough instrument, you will find stuff.
Well, okay, so that leads to my next question, right? Is what's acceptable? We're all consuming microplastics in our fish, and it's
so that's a kind of almost I'd say almost a loaded question, because the answer is we don't know that, and that's what has to be kind of determined here. And FDA doesn't have a good handle on this at this point in time of what should that limit be, because when we're consuming animal products, and this is the challenge they face with these questions, is they're coming at it as the grass certified product, or the grass hemp products that we have access to, they have limits that have been set, but people aren't eating those aren't assumed to be products eaten every single day all the time, usually, when they evaluated those, whereas meat may be, and maybe not so much fish, but when you get into chicken and pork and stuff like that, most people are eating some of those on a daily basis. And so what is the appropriate level to do that? And part of the recommendation when we go to put in a request to allow this as a feed ingredient, when we see that's where it's going, if all the data points that way, lets us pursue that option, then we got to kind of give them we think this is a reasonable level that should be allowed in the fish, and based off of a number of different parameters, both what's in the fish, how frequently people are expected to be eating that fish with that ingredient, and or fed these diets. it's a complicated question unto itself. And there was a recent conference with the Hemp Feed Coalition in Oregon State put on, and there was a lot of discussion around this exact point, because the grass products are different in how they're consumed than animal products that might contain these. We don't have a reference point, and that's a lot of the problem, really, is figuring out what those reference points are. If we had a level and said we have to meet this, our work would be a lot easier, because we could say, okay, as long as it's under this, we're fine. No big deal.
Are things specifically that are being looked at to evaluate this? What specific data points really help support and or baseline?
Right? That is a good question, and I think there's a lot of different ways to approach it, and I think we need to come at them from a lot of different ways to make that ultimately easier. The way we're going to pursue this with our research is that, we're looking at fish, we're going to look at how frequently fish are usually consumed, and based off of that, we're going to try to hit, and then we're going to take the GRAS recommendations and say, okay, this is what is allowed because this was deemed appropriate, and we're going to try to see if how those merge together, in the sense of, okay, if you eat this much fish, do you exceed the amount you would be getting from these GRAS products if you ate them at this rate that the FDA is deemed.
And after so long, right? Is there a way?
And after so long. Because the other way around that is to do very extensive long-term studies on human tolerance to cannabinoid use.
Well,
which gets into the whole thing that the FDA deals with on the CBD products and stuff.
Even what I learned at the Hemp Feed event at Oregon State was the weaning period, right? If we stop feeding them hemp products or CBD, because a lot of the studies they presented were like only flower or concentrate, on a much higher level of cannabinoid concentration.
Yeah, and those products are interesting from a different perspective. Totally. So I know there's work for, I believe it's milk cows with Oregon State, that they're looking at feeding the spent extracted flour.
Yeah.
To me, that's going to, in my personal opinion, that's a risky product to start with, because you're already, no matter how you extract, you're already starting with high levels of cannabinoids you're going to have to deal with in that residual. Whereas the grain doesn't have that problem. The stock on the fiber is probably not going to provide a whole lot of nutritional value unto itself, just because it's a lot of fiber. It's used as
which are great for some animals.
That's great. Well, yes, it's great for some animals. It's not necessarily nutritious for a lot of them without other protein and stuff in it. So so it's coming from the leaves and the flower, and those are where your trichomes are at. So to me, really, that's the safest start point is those seeds. But those other studies relating with flower will show how they're going to be real good on showing how fast stuff clears animal systems, to get what you said, where if we stop feeding at a certain date, then the product can still be safe.
Yes.
That is an approach, but I also recall from that same meeting that we were in there that the concern from the FDA side is it doesn't seem like that's an approach often done. And and so that would be a new kind of approach, and for feed approval. And it's also, and I could see why, because that one is, you're at the mercy of trusting that without a rigorous testing program for those meat products in place, animal products in place, you're at the mercy of the grower saying they did what they said they did.
Are there other meats though or other drugs right? Or material products that have that weaning period. That was my understanding.
Drugs do.
Right.
Drugs do, but as far as feed ingredients, I don't know. That's beyond my background. I'm a plant person, not an animal person by background. So that's a question. That's a very interesting question, but that's beyond me to be able to answer. I don't know if other feeds are like that, but I do know drugs are, because you can only give, and the same goes in plants and stuff, that on food crops, that you can only spray pesticides so many days before that crop is harvested. But those programs usually, in most cases, there's some random testing of lots to make sure things are compliant in those systems and pesticides are not detected. Okay, so there's going through some analytical chemistry to confirm things there. It's kind of analogous to, you're not of using pesticides in hemp flower production for smoked flower.
Right.
There's labs out there that, there's states that while they don't necessarily say what they do, they randomly test some products coming in that they're evaluating for THC for pesticide residue as well. Mm-hmm. I know Kentucky's done that. I know Ohio does that. They don't test every plant, but they test random batches to make sure things are not testing positive for pesticides.
So can you talk to me a little bit about like the genetic profile that you are looking at? Like what's important in the genetics and seed profile for fish food?
Yeah, so the genetic profile is going to be, obviously we're focused on grain varieties or what could be dual purpose varieties. We're not looking at grains that are coming out of high cannabinoid backgrounds, because the risk of them being contaminated with high levels of THC, CBD that are going to be potentially problematic in the final ingredient is much higher. So when it comes to,
like an omega, a good omega-6 compared to a 3, for example.
Yeah, so I was going to get to that. So the omega-3, for most varieties, there's variation within hemp, but the fatty acid profiles and the amount of protein within varieties is fairly similar. There's a range, plus minus 5-10% either way. We're not necessarily selecting based on, developing a feed on that. What we're more interested in is how much of that protein's in that total diet. Okay, so if you have a variety that gives you as higher in protein content, and you're defatting it and using that protein in the feed, you're going to have more protein in what you're extracting, so you're not going to have to extract quite as much. But again, most of the genetic profiles are fairly close. There's a bigger variation in that cannabinoid profile, and that's something that's, because it could be a contaminant, something that's more of a concern. So that's why grain fiber varieties, traditional dual purpose European varieties, all of those we're looking at. We're actually doing a variety trial with this, where we're putting out 20 different lines to evaluate all the amino acid compositions, the fatty acid profiles, the fiber contents, the anti-nutrient factors in it. So the big one there would be phytate, but we're also interested in a number of other components. And so we're going to do an analysis of all those varieties based on some of the work that's out there that's looked at different varieties and stuff like that. We expect them to fall within a certain range, all within a certain range and stuff. But what's a little different about the variety trial that we're going to do versus some of what's been done is, one, more the robustness of it, on the comprehensiveness of it, although there's a couple good studies about that. But we've intentionally selected very diverse germplasm. So I've got stuff that's from Canada, or varieties developed in Canada, Europe, different parts of Europe. I've got stuff from China, and I've got American lines, as many of the American lines as we could get a hold of.
Yeah.
And because that's, ultimately what I think what's bred in the U.S. is ultimately what's going to be grown best in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely getting those varieties evaluated, which haven't been evaluated before.
Yeah.
But we're also trying, because of, I was talking about the cannabinoid variation, there is a unique aspect of varieties being developed that is called triple crops, where they're looking at for the grain, the seeds, and the cannabinoid profile. I won't get into the feasibilities of doing those versus single-use ones, but we have at least one of those we're trying to include or we're going to include in the study. So then we have a reference point for, okay, when we harvest these, how much residual is winding up on the seed coat from something that has a higher a higher CBD content, THC content, because that's going to inform us about the contamination potential.
Mm-hmm.
And that one's actually going to be a tricky little seed to work with, because that variety that we have, there's a grower in Ohio that has that a Colorado-based tricrop type, and he's working with us to provide the seed for the study, and it's a really small seed compared to even the European type. And then that looks small compared to some of these Chinese varieties,
which is small compared to the traditional grain of corn, soybean. We've
got a variety that's almost up to the size of a soybean in the seed size.
Yeah.
So we've got a massive variation size. So what we were going for is maximum diversity. A lot of the collection, the studies out there of like, okay, well, this is stuff out of a Canadian varieties, out of a Canadian breeding program, in breeding lines that are unnamed that were tested, or particularly European germplasm that's been evaluated. Sometimes that gets thrown with some Canadian stuff. There's a little work done about the Chinese, but really throwing those all into the same mix, there's not a lot of good data on that at this point. You can piece it from different articles, but we just want to see that variation. The tricrop's going to be really interesting addition to this to see what happens. Unfortunately, we planted our trial this year, and nothing came up. We replanted it, nothing came up again. Learned out that there was a 2-year herbicide carryover issue that was keeping it from doing it. So we took the list from some stuff that University of Wisconsin's done some work on herbicide carryover, and there was a list a farmer that our corn breeder works with had put down on the ground 2 years ago, and it was apparently still active. Mm-hmm. So we didn't get any data this year, unfortunately. But we're going to do at least 3 years of data collection on those variety trials, so we could see different germplasm, but also different germplasm across that same germplasm across years to see environmental impact, which may make a difference on chemical properties. And it'll be interesting to see the year impact on these chemical processes, on these chemical profiles.
We went through the same thing at one of our trial locations. We planted multiple times and didn't get anything because of carryover from pesticides and herbicides.
I think it's something that we need to be a lot more cognizant of as an industry, because some of we have our farm manager here used before he joined our land grant research program, worked for a chemical application company applying herbicides, and some of those that are on the 2+ year carryover list that Wisconsin found are routinely sprayed on corn.
Or drift. There's a major problem with drift.
Drift will be an issue as well. So it's just hemp growers are going to have to be very wary of that, because it's seen in all the studies that people have done trying to find herbicides to use on hemp for weed control. They basically all found that most every herbicide is really good for killing hemp at some point. and it doesn't tolerate it well. I forget the two, but there's two that were kind of better-ish.
Yeah.
But they still cause damage at certain levels.
I feel like what works best is tighter sowing densities.
Yeah, and ultimately it comes down to that stand establishment to control the weeds. And for hemp growers, that's going to be tighter stand establishment, those row spacings, not having those wide rows, get that 7-8 inch row spacing, those higher plant densities, and getting good establishment early on, which requires good viable seed, and the viability of the seed drops fast. Even at some point I want to do a study looking at the viability duration of seeds, but just from stuff I've had that I'd known the germination 1 year and planting it the next, even in a refrigerator, that stuff, it drops by about half within a year of holding it in a refrigerator. So it's like we got to find better ways to store hemp seed for one. But yeah, the herbicide that's down in the ground, as well as we're going to control the herbicides in our crop, or the weeds in our crops, probably not through herbicide mechanisms for hemp, but through cultural practices. But it's those herbicides that were applied to something else that I think we really are going to have to watch, because obviously it come and got us. And
knowing what your neighbors are doing. For runoff. I mean, I can't imagine some of the bad, rain or runoff that we're going to see from one field to the next as well, that just being aware of. Well, it's pretty fascinating. What would you say out of all of the research you're doing? I'm curious about what you're most excited about. Like, what are you expecting could really potentially turn the table, or worried that you may not find the results? Like, I'm kind of curious, what is this?
Yeah, excellent question. There's a lot of it that's really interesting to me. I think probably the single most interesting study that we'll be doing, especially and we'll be doing it at Central State, is we're going to give some high doses of cannabinoids to fish and look at the metabolism in the fish of that, because at the moment there's zero really decent references at all. There's like one paper I found that even touches on that subject of the cannabinoids metabolizing into things within the fish. We know when you ingest cannabinoids in any other, or a lot of other animals, humans, rats, mice, different livestock, that it gets metabolized into different compounds, which then bring their own risk to them. But then it also impacts the kinetics of how that clears out of the system. Is that coming out in the urine or the feces and different things? And so we're going to give some of these trout very high doses of these or doses of cannabinoids directly, and look at some of that more pharmacokinetic type data to see what that turns into, and how fast that clears out of the system in fish, in rainbow trout. And I think that's going to be really important for determining that, back to the question of that threshold that's going to be allowed. Because if we know how fast the fish clears it out of its system, then we could easily determine a weaning rate based on, or a rate for when we don't feed them a hemp-based diet, if that's a concern, or if it clears fast enough, which I think based on a lot of other animals, it may clear quite fast, and then so it may not be an issue, but because of trout particularly having a lot of fat stores, that's why it's omega rich, and these being fat soluble compounds, maybe it won't clear fast. And so what they get fed does accumulate. That's something we really, really need to know. And so we're going to look at that very closely. Yeah. I think that's something that, like I said, there's one study out there that I found where they fed some zebrafish some cannabinoids and tried to look at some of the metabolites they got. But they got a lot of unknowns, and they didn't quantify or they weren't able to tell what those were and figure those out. And so it's like, doesn't provide a very good, robust understanding of what's happening. And,
Sure.
and it's zebrafish. It's not a food species. So
Sure.
that I think is probably going to be the most interesting to me. But we got to develop a lot of protocols around that to make that single study work. But I think it's going to be really, really interesting.
Awesome. Well, fascinating. So tell me, what can people do to support you? What can we as an association do either to support the industry, the growth really of bringing hemp as a feed product, right? I will give shout out to Hemp Feed Coalition. Make sure you donate, become a member, support their research. These applications are very expensive when there are not grants tied to them. Even when there are grants tied to them, the time that goes into them is, like Dr. Craig just explained, it's years and years of research and work. And so please go out and support Hemp Feed Coalition, because it is not just one study, but a collaboration of multiple universities and multiple, academic that are putting together research to really look at each of these different aspects.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing could be is events like this where we get a chance to connect with the people out there, because we don't know the people we don't know. And
Right.
until we get in contact with each other, we don't know how we can be mutually beneficial. We're a land grant institution. We're a research institution. Mm-hmm. We get federal funds. This is federal funds to benefit American industry, agriculture industry. And that's what we do. And so, being connected with us, we're all this information is going to be made publicly available because that's the nature of what we do. And so connecting with us is a great way to do that. And we're always happy to talk and meet people, because then we're like, oh, we didn't know this was a thing. We could do this, or, oh, you're doing that. Well, great. So it's those relationships are really helpful, because again, in this particular case, we have of the $10 million project, over $5 million of it's dedicated to research and personnel for this particular part. That project also contains some outreach, education components, and education and extension components, which is where the other money comes in. But including we'll be bringing tribal students to an HBCU to really, because we think that may be a better fit for them than just jumping to large research institutions. But so that's other parts of this project that all tie together. But these are we got to fund people to do this, and they are expensive. These are. And the larger and the longer the production cycle of the animal, the more expensive it's going to be. Because really you can't use these animals for anything other than just the research, because if they're filled with unknowns in the view of the FDA, they can't go into the commercial feed supply. There's exceptions to why that could potentially happen, but that's a lot more work and effort. So probably I wouldn't count on that route.
Not a very normal,
viable option, honestly. So if you're working with cattle, that's going to be a really pricey feed application. But the more animals we work with, the more species we work with, the more species of fish we work with, builds the overall data pool that we can reference for. So like when we do a variety trial here and say, okay, this is, along with the other papers that are out there, we show yearly impact on these nutritional profiles, anti-nutritional profiles, the diversity of what's out there. That's something that could be useful for other feed applications. And so that's not so like we're going to be we'll reference the ones that are out there. We're doing our own for our own reasons, but it could build on each other, but it has to, in the case of the applications, say AFCO FDA, they have to be relevant in the context of the feed that you've designed and that you're creating. So,
it'll be interesting.
You easily get papers for lots of things, but most of them aren't relevant to what your particular application is until you've done it in that species of interest. But if you've done it in one fish species, you could start making arguments that, well, this is what we found in this species. When we move to, say, catfish or whatever else, salmon, they may be very close, and that may be relevant literature for them. And in the case of salmon and trout, they're very closely related. They're both salmonids, so that's something that would be very relevant in a future salmon application. So
yeah, I love it. Okay, well, I would love to share contact information or help collaborate on some of this. Anything we can do to help get information out or knowledge, share it and cross promote it. I would love to.
Yeah, I can make sure you guys have access to everything that that we're putting out, and so you can distribute
and vice versa
stuff and yeah, exactly. And anybody that run into you want to connect with us, feel free to do so. Anybody listening that wants to connect to us, my email's very simple. My name's up on the screen. It's just C and then Schluttenhofer, all lowercase, at centralstate.edu. So make sure you write that down before that disappears, because good luck remembering Schluttenhofer.
I'm going to share it right here so everybody has.
But anybody wants to contact me, feel free to do so. We've had some press releases and stuff about this project. So if you search, my colleague in charge of the project's Dr. Brandy Phipps, so you could find her having given several talks on different things related to this, and her contact information. We could get in contact with each other. So if you get a hold of one of us, we could share it to the rest of the team, and we're very just happy to connect with people. We've talked to a lot of great people in the industry. It's an industry, everybody's got their own views on things, which is fun, challenging in its own right when doing applications like this, where you have to have multiple people working in a kind of a set direction. But it's fun working with people with lots of different viewpoints. We have an advisory committee for the project, and they didn't necessarily like the idea. There was a couple of them that didn't necessarily like the idea of us using hemp hearts, because that's a high value hemp product.
Yeah.
And we're like,
that was exactly
scale that up, might reduce the price of that. But if you're looking in the context of fish, we can work that economics out. But we're like, this is what we have to use if we want to use it for fish.
Sure.
The seed cake with all that fiber in it won't work. I was like, that's just the reality of it. So if we want to do this and make hemp as a feed option for fish, at least rainbow trout, that fiber content's not an option.
Well, and I think
maybe some other fish it is.
It goes so much to the full life cycle, right? The entire impact, not just the payment of that exchange at the register for the feed, but how that feed impacts the entire sustainability or life cycle.
Yeah. And trout's a high value fish. If anybody buys trout, it's not a cheap fillet to go get. Pretty delicious. I'm not a big fish person, but I like trout. It's really delicious. The people pay more for it. So that's going to play into the overall economic analyses as well. Is we started with trout for a number of reasons. One, because it's a higher value fish. Two, it's a fish that fish meal, fish oil are obligately required for, and we need to get that out of those diets. And so it's a good test for that. There's a fair bit of trout production in the U.S., so it's a U.S. relevant fish. And we're interested we want to see, because hemp is one of the other side things we're looking at. We don't necessarily expect an increase. We want to see if we could remove that fish meat or that fish oil ingredient, replace it with hemp oil, and retain that the high omega-3 fatty acid profile. And we think we could do that with hemp instead of other crops that don't have that, where if you remove that out of the diet completely, that's going to be, you're probably going to reduce that in the fish. And that also may be some of the reasons why they don't tolerate some of these plant-based diets, is because that some of those omega-3s could feed into those longer chain fats that they would be normally getting from their fish diet. So I saw that question earlier, and I think that's a good tie together why we went with trout.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I sure appreciate it. I would also love to share, we've done fiber trials in 10 states, 10 varieties in 10 different states. And this year we'll be doing grain varieties. I would love to kind of chat with you and maybe explore or look over some of that. Ours are not as robust, right? Because we're not necessarily we're looking for a yield of production so that we can really look at, scalability for farmers to get more acres in the ground. But I would definitely be curious, what varieties maybe we should be paying attention to, or some
Absolutely.
that got some data.
I can give a fair bit of insight on that. I've grown in Kentucky, I've grown in Ohio here. I've grown a number of different varieties, and I could lend some insight onto that.
Yeah.
We're going to collect yield data on our varieties as well. So it's going to be a much smaller one, but we'll use a plot combine. But we will collect yield data and to provide that information. But just on my experience, I could, based on regions, pretty well predict what's going to work in most locales. And because I do anything, this is all fun for me. Anything hemp's fun for me. Really, the only part I don't deal with hemp on is the econ side. I don't do the math, the business.
I know it's good.
I can do rough numbers, but and say, hey, if you're running negative on paper, you're never going to make money. Or if you're even making money on paper, that doesn't guarantee you're going to make money in practice.
Right.
But beyond that, I do anything from all the way from seeds to processed products, and I'm interested in any of that, which is why I love this crop, because I get to use all these different backgrounds that I've got training in, and it's just such a fun plant.
Well, I sure appreciate it, and I appreciate all the work you're doing. I would love to, like I said, continue to collaborate or support anything that we can do moving forward to assist on research. I am adamant to avoid wasting dollars doing the same thing. So if we can build on the existing research or really complement it, I know that's what we would be all about. So I'll be in touch. And again, if there's anything you need, same with anything else, anybody else online, if you guys have questions for Dr. Craig or myself, don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. Our contact information is shared. And if you have specific questions that we weren't able to answer today, let me know. Equally as much, Dr. Craig, if you have students or other people that you're working with that have research or have some projects, what I'd be really interested in is like plant-based materials that are being developed through your university or in some of those divisions.
Yeah, we could
highlight them.
I could work on that, and we could possibly find somebody to chat about those types of things as well. I've got a number of other projects going on, and we got some stuff that is a little more, at least initial level, proprietary, working with a company, but I know he will probably be developing some new materials. So
very cool.
So we have lots of fun things.
Yeah, let's however we can use our platform to get knowledge out and help make connections, we're all about it. So thank you very, very much. We will be back tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. You can watch it on YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, or LinkedIn. If you are not following us on any of those channels, make sure that you do so you get notices, especially on our YouTube channel. And other than that, you guys, thank you very much and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you all. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. We'll talk later.